Where does the social go? Because aren't they just only these individuals?
Well, that's what the importance of the actual utterance is. Because language, we have physical concrete forms and unified signifiers that we use to communicate to each other. So even if we have different perspectives and different ways of viewing these signifiers, the reason we construct language is to create unified systems of meaning in order to communicate things. So you never really know if someone understands what you're saying, but you assume they do. And you assume that you can understand someone else's perspective based on what they've told you from their experiences and kind of come to an understanding of what they're trying to create through their utterances. But that was the real problem with Kundera, is for him, you couldn't actually go inside the internal universe of another person. You couldn't actually understand them. You can't actually physicalize any of your internal thoughts in ways that makes them really exist as they exist for you. And so that is like the eternal problem. But the difference I tried to like kind of combat with the Lady Gaga thing is say, we have a very like active, evolving culture, and individuals do create actions that do influence other people. So whether or not it's a direct interpretation of your internal being or not, you do communicate. So.
But by accident?
Not by accident. I mean, there is intention, but it's not necessarily always realized.
How would you know when it's realized? No, I'm just, where does the inter come from? It means intersubjectivity. I mean, that's because it seems to me that's what you're calling back to.
Well, that's where, I mean, language precedes every individual. So all of our knowledge is acquired through language or through some sort of interpretation of others' actions. So we do have unified signifiers. Like if I say up, you know what I'm referring to. And even if it's not necessarily, I think a lot of what's missed is the emotional content. And that's something that can't necessarily always be transcribed into a physical form. But you can create meaning for other people.
I also have a question for Becca, which has to do with whether you thought at all about the gender dynamic that seems to be going on when you compare the model that Kundera has with the model that Lady Gaga has, with his emphasis on the autonomous, lonely individual.
Yeah. I mean, they're both completely opposite. So.
Interactive thing, even their fears. He fears that he will be left alone in his individualized world. Nobody will understand him. She fears that she will be scrutinized under, you could say, the male gaze, or that people will look at her in ways that diminish her. So it's really interesting to see how these topics kind of lend themselves to thinking about gender.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't actually discuss this in my thesis, but I do agree with you. And I think that with Kundera's perspective, it is a lot about male ecocentrism, and that's like recurrent in a lot of his writing, I think, at least. And with Lady Gaga, it is the opposite. It's like a female pop figure trying to assert her agency and create an identity against the patriarchal forms of how women are usually viewed. So there is this kind of contrasting dynamic between them that I agree with, yeah.
I'm trying to, I think that what you're trying to say is perhaps, or explain this to me, is that language in a way, or whatever, are you connecting this thought with the language process, and then are you trying to say that it is not so much the thought or the language process that gives, that the thought gives rise to, that it's difficult to translate into a physical?
Yeah, it's just that, I mean, we all think in language, and language is a part of how we form our identity. Not always, like we think in other forms as well, and we feel other forms as well. But when we create expression, we don't necessarily consciously think about all the different layers of what's going into forming the expression, but each individual is unique, and when they create something, it's based on all of their experiences that they've had in the past, all the different ways in which they've acquired language and acquired ideas and ways of communicating. So even if you can understand directly what a person's saying, you don't necessarily understand all of the events that led up to them saying that. And so you don't necessarily understand all of the internal aspects of their expression, and neither does the person who's speaking necessarily. It's just, you can't grasp the internal being of another person, and you can't really grasp your own. People are constantly changing. So, yeah, that's kind of what I meant.